Today I'm speaking with Sarah Caton. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Sarah lives in Estes Park, Colorado. I'd love to hear in a minute what life's like there. It sounds like a beautiful part of the country. She has two children. She's a video editor, an artist, and a writer. She earned her bachelor's in molecular biology with a minor in art from Metropolitan State College of Denver. She's publishing her memoir coming out on May 10th called Deconstructing, Memoir of a Preacher's Daughter. And we'll have the link, the pre-order link for that for Amazon beneath this video. I'll replace it once the full version is out, so you can go check that out. But besides what I know about you so far, Sarah, please tell us more about yourself.
Well, like you said, I'm an artist, writer, musician. I kind of just love to do everything creative. Um, and I'm hoping that I've also done lamp working, like working with glass art. So I'm
Like
hoping I
Tiffany
eventually,
lamps?
no, like making little sculptures and stuff on a torch.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Very cool.
So I'm hoping to start up my own little side business on that and, my book publish. And
That's awesome. And how old are your kids?
so the two that live at home are 9 and 18. And then I
Okay.
have a 22, almost 23-year-old that has moved out onto the big world.
Okay. So you got three kids, but two of them living at home. Very
Mhm.
cool. And what's before you tell us something, more about your hobbies, just could I ask what's life like in Estes Park, Colorado? Are you in the ski zone or what's it like there?
Oh, yeah. Well, so this town, is very touristy, I would say, in the summer. You get all these people coming up to go to the Rocky Mountain National Park. But, I personally think it's very beautiful. There's elk and deer just everywhere you go, kind of hanging out like cattle, hanging around town.
Hmm, that's
And there's a
awesome.
lot of really great things because it's kind of a touristy area, but there's a lot of really great, music opportunities and stuff like that up here just for that reason.
Hmm, that's cool. I've got some family over in Boulder. I need to get out there again. It's such a great part of the country. Well, before we get started, tell us one more hobby or a fun, quirky thing or something unique about yourself.
Gosh. Well, I have a dog and a cat, and we like to go on walks together. The cat like follows along with us, kind of like
Without a leash.
yeah, yeah, he just comes along. He thinks he's a dog.
That's cool.
Kind of fun.
Very nice. Yeah, I've seen those videos where sometimes they'll have an actual cat that's trained to walk on a leash, but it's really cool that yours just follows. Well, again, we're obviously here to hear your story. So if you could take us back, obviously we're going to touch on your book eventually and how that came about. But before we get into the book part of it, if you could tell us, what was behind the book, how did you get exposed to Christianity, and how did your story go?
Right. Well, I mean, I was born into it. There was no choice really for me. Just my dad is a preacher and, preacher missionary slash. He felt like Utah was his mission field. He graduated from Bob Jones University as a preacher boy and, chose to come to Utah specifically because he thought there was a lot of unsaved people there. So that's, I was born, he was already into the ministry. He had a church that he was starting up in Salt Lake City area. So I was born and there, and then, we ended up moving down to this smaller town because his main job was to plant churches. Um, so I was one of five kids that they had, I was like the second oldest. And we were all sort of just supposed to be little missionaries too, basically.
Can I ask what denomination of church was it?
So it was IFB, Independent Fundamentalist Baptist.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was thinking that was the direction. And can I ask one more thing? Was he targeting Mormons or just people in general in Utah?
Mormons, yeah. That was
Okay,
his main, because he felt like Mormons were unsaved and he had to convert them into the Baptists. So it was
right.
kind of an interesting, like they're already religious and they're just kind of swapping religions, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting that you mentioned Bob Jones. That's where I went for my freshman year. I was in the Preacher Boys program there. I didn't finish there, but it is that's quite a journey being from Bob Jones. I'm sure if he was there for 4 or more years, the indoctrination goes pretty deep. Did you go to Bob Jones yourself, or did you learn about it yourself as you grew up as to kind of what they do there?
Yeah. Yeah. So his ministry was based on the Bob Jones model. And we were basically like I look at it like Bob Jones was sort of training all these preachers to go out and just be like satellite Bob Joneses all around the country or all around the world. And so that's essentially what it was, because everything, it was like Bob Jones was like glorified, like worshiped. We had all the music, we listened to all the preacher, they would send out these cassette tapes with like the preacher, speaking in chapel. We would listen to that. The curriculum we were homeschooled with was mainly Bob Jones curriculum. And like we were just really pushed to go there. So my older sister went all 4 years, graduated from there. I went for 3 years and left. But going to Bob Jones was kind of part of my deconstructing. It was like, it was built up so much all of my life. It's just this like, this is the pinnacle of Christianity. This is the place, and when I got there, I was just so let down, I think, really, by what it really was. I could see through all the BS, and I just, completely started unraveling my beliefs.
Mhm.
Like,
But I definitely want to get there. I know I apologize. I probably pushed just a little bit too soon or too late in your story there with those questions. But feel free to take us back to the earlier days as to kind of how your earlier years evolved with Christianity.
yeah. So, like I was born, my dad being a preacher, I had to go to church all the time. Not even when there was no church, we were just there like working and stuff. I kind of grew up in a church, and there was no option to not go. You had to kind of be on your deathbed to get out of church. Even if you were like running a fever, they'd be like, just go sit in the back away from people. And then I, of course, really, I was a very devout believer, even from a young age. My parents said I prayed the sinner's prayer and became a, full-on saved believer Christian when I was 4 years old. I don't even remember doing that. Like the time they told me I first got saved, I don't remember. So it was sort of just always ingrained in me from the very beginning that you are a Christian, you are saved, you've done this. And so as I got older, I started to doubt things, and I would repeatedly pray that prayer, thinking like maybe this time it'll stick. But I always felt like it wasn't working or something.
Was part of the motivation the fear of hell if you were not legitimate the first time?
Definitely. Yep. And I had this really intense fear all through my childhood of the rapture coming and taking my whole family and leaving me behind. I just kept thinking like maybe I'm not really saved. Oh, I had a bad thought. Maybe that means I'm not saved. I lusted after something or craved that rock music or whatever it was. And then I would assume like, oh, it didn't work. I better pray it again. And, it just kind of felt like one of my biggest fears was the rapture coming and that I would be left alone to go through the tribulation or, all the things that my parents believed that the Christians would be raptured pre-tribulation, because I know that there's people that think they'll be raptured in the middle or at the end of it too. So that's kind of an interesting, the differences between like the end times theologies.
Hmm. So you were that was like a carryover of the fear, like what if I'm professing faith, but I'm not really truly saved, like I'm kind of playing the game or something, the Christian game, and I'm not really a true child of God. Did you
Yeah,
did you ever evolve out of that, or did that carry through into your teenage years?
that carried through all the way until I started deconstructing, when I was in college, probably.
Hmm. That's a lot of pressure to just feel like you're never really settled, like you're always kind of looking over your back or feeling like the carpet's going to get pulled out from under your feet. That's but on an eternal level.
I think that was definitely part of my, religious trauma that I'm now healing from as a grown adult, 46 years old, is realizing how much of the trauma I experience even now in my present day comes from that like constant fear, and that, like you said, kind of like, when's that rug going to get pulled out from under me? And always living on edge of like worrying about that, because it's a horrible thing to put into a child's mind that you could do, just one day you could wake up and think it's going to be a normal day, but nope, you lose your whole family that day, right? And that's a fear that you have to live with, but you can't tell anybody, right?
Yeah.
As a child, and especially in the preacher's family, you're supposed to be the model Christian. You're supposed to show all the people what it's like to be a Christian. And those, you can't be doubting your faith.
Yeah. And the typical message in the IFB, I think, from my understanding, is very much once saved, always saved. That if your profession was real, and some professions, of course, are pretend, but if your profession was real in the first place, then you're saved. God started it, he's going to bring it to completion. And the Romans 8, if God loves you and you're in his hands, nothing's going to take you out of his hands. But it's one thing that it's interesting, and love to hear your thoughts on this too, is just the idea of whenever you would sin, did you feel like the sin was possible evidence that you just didn't love God enough? Like if you loved him enough, if you were truly saved, you'd love him, you'd hate sin, you'd love
Mhm.
purity, and you'd love and holiness and obedience to God and surrender. Therefore, if you did sin, whether it was something grievous like a sexual thought, or it's just as simple as like I just really want to talk back to my parents and I just don't like doing what they say today. I feel like being whatever me to them or my siblings, that anything on the spectrum of sin is just another evidence that you're truly not caring about holiness, and therefore you're in danger. Did that come into the equation?
Yeah, definitely. That was kind of the reasoning was like, well, it must not have, I must not have been really saved because otherwise I wouldn't have thought that thought or I wouldn't have wanted to do that thing. And I kept thinking that that was evidence that it hadn't. And also, there's just this whole, how could it be that you just say one thing, I believe in you and I'm placing my life in your hands, dear Jesus, or whatever. That one thing you say is gonna make or break your soul for all eternity. And it just felt like such a flimsy, there was no like solidness in my mind. I kept wanting to, like, where was the contract that you signed? Or, like there was just like, oh, you just say the thing and now it's over. You're saved for the rest of your life. And it just felt a little fishy to me. And maybe that was, I don't know, that was just part of me being, I'm sort of like a detective. And I was always trying to get to the bottom of things and understand. And I'd be like, well, how can it be that, one person can just live a horrible life, murder people, whatever. And then at the end of their life, they say one prayer and boom, they're up in heaven, right? And then there's this someone else, maybe they were born into a Muslim family, but they lived a really good life. They were always really good, but nope, you go to hell because you didn't say the prayer. And I just thought, even as a kid, I would wrestle with these ideas of like, how is that fair? How is that even a thing?
Did your theology ever get answers to that as you listened to the preacher or read the Bible or just thought through it yourself? Did you come up with any solutions to those particular questions that were at least quasi satisfactory?
No, I mean, I tried. I was the kid that would go and read the Bible on my own to try to find the answers. I would go into my dad's study. He had all these books on the theology and, that he'd gotten in college and stuff. And I would read them on my own because I wanted to know the answers. Um, but
Mm.
I couldn't, like here I am, like most kids are just reading, comics or something. And I'm in there reading like, what's this guy say about Thessalonians?
Yeah,
But
exactly. I felt
but I
like
was
the thing that I was going to say, the thing that got me was I felt like I got answers that I, to my shame, accepted of like the reason that this seems unfair is you don't understand God well enough. Someday you will, and you'll bow your knee and you'll be glad that he's so holy that he is destroying all the Muslims and he is destroying this person. You'll be glad that he's that opposed to sin, and you feel like eventually your theology is like, oh, I'm slowly catching up with God's character, and I'm proud of that, and I'm good now. My answers come. They're obviously horrible answers, but
yeah, there is that sense of like in a lot of the Christian circles of like kind of patting each other's backs, like, oh, like confirming with each other and making it feel normal. And I heard about this. So there's kind of this idea that, to keep people in the faith, you want to keep them isolated. And, so that creating a community where it's so weird, and yet everyone in that community believes the same thing and they all kind of validate each other's viewpoint. But then when you start getting a little farther outside of that circle, it's uncomfortable. And so it's a way to sort of keep people from straying, is to make it to where it's like a private club of beliefs.
Hmm.
And so you don't want to leave your private club or you're going to be a weirdo outsider out here. So you better come back over here.
Yeah, and they seem to really do a good job, good in quotes, of sheltering you in the sense of you need to stay close to the Lord and close to good teaching, but also when they poison the well and just say, like, look, if those people have other ideas, but they're not committed to the Lord and to the Word of God, the best they can come up with is still horrible, doctrines of demons and darkness. If you're not committed to the same theology, anything else is a drift and going down the slippery slope. And so you end up thinking that you don't need other answers, you just need more Bible. And it's very the insulation is crazy until you see it. You're like, wow, like that's intense what they did to me. But while you're in it, you're quite proud of it. It's like, I don't want garbage in my head. I want the Word of God and the Word of God alone.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's like the brainwashing of a cult, essentially. If you look at what makes a cult, and you just really break it down, you realize like Christianity, some sects of Christianity are a cult.
Yeah.
And I think the IFB is definitely one of them.
Hmm. Could I ask, just for a pinpoint in your story, what did salvation itself mean? Like if you would have at that juncture, say your early teen, mid-teen years, if you had a friend who said to you, I'm not sure I'm saved. It sounds like you are. I want to get saved. What would you have said to them to get saved?
Well, I did actually lead my little Mormon friend to Christ when we were, it was like I was a little soul winner. And I would say, you just have to pray the sinner's prayer. You have to, invite Jesus to come into your heart and wash away your sins. And then he'll be your, Lord and Savior or whatever.
Hmm.
It was the terminology that was used in, that time.
And your friend did that when you explained it all?
She did, yep. So she was this little Mormon friend I had, and we would hang out and play, and sometimes we would talk religious differences and all that. And I was really pressured her. Like I look back on it now and I feel bad. Just how much pressure I put on her to become, to pray the sinner's prayer. And
Hmm.
I was so excited, and I ran down and told my mom, like, "Oh, Becky just got saved," and nothing really came of it. She didn't like start coming to our church or anything. And I think she kind of just forgot that she did it. Um, but and I was also like a camp counselor for my dad ran a summer camp, like an extension of his ministry kind of a thing. And so I worked there every summer. Growing up, at first I would do like just the horses or the groundskeeping or the, kitchen jobs because I was too young. But then eventually I became a camp counselor, and I would go out with the kids at the end of the service when they would have the big call, like everybody come forward and give your life to God, or come, get saved. And I would take people out and pray with them and stuff. And so there were a couple people that like dedicated their life to service at, missions, or got saved, that I would pull them out and do the prayers with them and stuff.
Hmm. So it's an amazing journey, and so much of what you're sharing, I can relate to a whole bunch of it. I didn't grow up in a strictly Baptist church, but it was like a non-denominational Baptistic church. We went to, I was in Pennsylvania. We went to this Baptist camp in the summer. It was called OPEN for like Ohio, Pennsylvania, right on the border, and I believe, and very Baptistic and run by Baptists. But I got that messaging, and you really, you get a sense that like when you're growing up, these are your people. This is your family. They're here to keep you safe. They love you. They just want you to obviously get saved. and just live a good life, live a life of purity. And until those thoughts come of like, what if we're wrong, and what if there's something else to this story that I'm not being told about, it can feel quite. I know it's a lot of people go through some trauma. Maybe the pastor does something inappropriate or something. But if you don't have those experiences, it can really feel like I'm in a good spot. Like and I know every religion kind of does this, but you just feel like, how privileged am I to be in not just the right religion, but the right interpretation of religion? I could have grown up in an Arminian group, or whatever they would have said, like, some other Lutheran church where they don't even preach the gospel, and I could have been this and that, and you
Mhm.
just think, wow, this is such a privileged position. I'm so glad I understand like deep theology that's biblically based, and you just kind of put your smile on and have an arrogance of like, I'm doing pretty good here. This is awesome. And it's amazing how it works, especially if you're doing like what you said, where you're involved in the ministry, where you're not just absorbing, you're turning it outward and sharing the gospel and doing ministry, which I did as well. You feel like this is the best life. Like there's nothing better than to just show people the love of Jesus Christ every day, and to keep falling in love with him through the preaching and private Bible study of just like, this is the love life with my Lord and Savior. And it's interesting to hear some of your part of your story, because I can relate to a lot of it. When you look back at just all those events going on, what was it like on the private side? Like, did you have a sense that you could talk to God, and even as a young child, but for sure as a teenager, to just say, God, like I'm really struggling with this or that, or I'm depressed, or I don't know which, they're talking about college in a year or two. I don't know which college to go to. Like, God, show me your will. Or God, which boy do I date, or whatever. Did you feel like you could talk to God and share with him your fears and your hurts, and he was like actively working in your heart and giving you peace and things like that?
I would say I mostly felt like it was a one-sided conversation with God. Like God was listening always, which was sort of disconcerting because whatever thought I had, God could hear it, right? So I would kind of run a conversation in my head a lot, like, Dear Jesus, why did this happen? Or Dear God, kind of just almost like the way I think of it now is like if you had an imaginary friend that you talk to all the time, you know, which it basically is. But
Yeah, bingo.
um, but what I never felt was that God talked back to me. I never felt like some people would be like, God led me to do this, or I really felt God putting this on my heart. And I would be like, what's that like? What does that feel like? Is it just your intuition, or, like how do you hear God? Because I didn't, it was just me talking to God, but not really hearing anything coming back. And then they would
Yeah,
say, well, God doesn't actually speak to you. You have to go read the Bible. That's how God talks to you now. Like there's not prophets receiving direct messages from the Lord anymore, according to them.
yeah,
But so I would go to the Bible and read and say, what am I almost like, just open it up to some passage and be like, what am I supposed to learn today, God? um, and I don't even, like I don't even know if other people heard God either talking. Or if they did hear someone talking, maybe it's like a sign of a mental illness, because really you shouldn't be hearing other voices talking to you inside your head, probably. But
yeah. I can, again, it's amazing how many things I can relate to. I had an elder in my church who, I'll spare the full story, but just in a nutshell, he went down that road that you're talking about, and I kind of clarified like, what do you mean? I'm not sure. I may have misunderstanding your question. He's like, no, no, I'm serious. Like, I want to know. You're telling me you want to be a pastor. You've been studying at Bob Jones and Lancaster Bible College to be a pastor. You're now doing your internship. What is God saying to you that he's not saying to anybody else? And
mm-hmm.
I'm like, he's not saying anything to me that he's not saying to anybody else. Like I go to the Bible and I stay right within the bounds of what he said to everyone in the Bible. He's like,
Mm-hmm.
there's a problem. You can't be a pastor if God's not talking directly to you and giving you a message that he's not giving anyone else. I'm like, yikes.
Wow.
So I've just invested my whole, time. At that point, I wasn't deconstructing it all, but it was just like, it put me on edge. I'm like, how do you conjure God's voice if you've been pursuing it and you think you've been doing the right thing and interpreting it correctly? And they're saying, no, no, there's a lot more to this. And if you were really spiritual and in tune with God, you'd sense that voice very distinctly. There'd be no question. You wouldn't misunderstand anything. You'd say, yeah, God's telling me this. it definitely puts you on edge when you realize that discrepancy is going on, especially if I wasn't like in the Pentecostal charismatic groups, but
Mhm.
those groups obviously put some of those concepts on steroids. You're like, yeah, I heard God tell me to, pick the blue car instead of the red car. It's like, okay, I'm definitely not going down that road.
Yeah. Yeah, it just feels like, who are you actually listening to?
Yeah.
When you think you're listening to God, I don't even, yeah.
Hmm. Can I ask, just in terms of, again, putting some context to your story before you tell us what happened next? What were the typical two aspects that are kind of related: the gender roles, and how did that gender roles play into purity culture in terms of the way your parents raised you, and expectations if you had stayed on the straight and narrow going forward?
That was another part of it that was for me really challenging because girls were, it was like being sort of a second class human. Um, and it felt like I was actually mad a lot growing up that I was born a girl because I thought it just meant automatic loss of power over my life, loss of control, loss of agency. I had to listen to the man figure over me, and then the man figure over him, and the man figure over him. And it was just this hierarchy of male authority figures all the way down. And, they thought women couldn't preach or teach men, that they had to just submit. The wife submits to the husband no matter what, and almost like a slave relationship in a way. And
Very much so.
so I was kind of groomed from the very beginning to be a good wife for somebody. And that's what, they kind of kept pushing, was like, well, you can do this for your husband someday, or, you need to learn how to sew so you can, take care of your family someday. And it was always this kind of this push towards learning these domestication skills. And, I was a tomboy. I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to have a fulfilling life of my own choice. And so I really bucked up against that, the guide towards being a good wife, being a good church member, and not disagreeing or asking too many questions, because I was really good at asking like pointed questions that maybe there was no answer to, or they didn't want to tell me the answer to.
If you
Go
had
ahead.
stayed in that frame of mind and worldview, your expectation would have been that they would have wanted and hoped that you would have wanted to just get married and be very, very ultra submissive to your future husband, with the goal of together establishing a very Christian family and kids that obviously love the Lord, and just
Mhm.
keep the process, keep the ball moving.
Keep it, yeah, keep the payroll of new converts. What I call them is captive converts. Is when you're a child born into a family, you don't really have a choice to convert. Um,
Hmm.
but yes, so I would either have done that, or I was also like toying with the idea of being a missionary, which is the only other accepted profession for women. In is either you're a good wife, or you can be a missionary, and you can be a single missionary without, as a woman, without any blowback. But that's pretty much the only two options. If you want to be, you're like, hey, I want to be a lawyer, they're going to be like, how is that serving God? You know? So yeah, the trajectory of my life was definitely aimed towards, yeah, like being a domestic servant for a man someday.
Hmm. Just curious, in that context, with marriage being the overarching end goal, as a young teenager and growing up and expecting that to be eventually what happens. Two questions related to that. The first one was there any kind of sex education? And secondarily, what was the dating slash courtship? What were the rules like for when you did eventually start to come of age and start to have the option to pursue somebody or be pursued? What was the best path forward in terms of biblical morality of dating?
So yeah, there was no sex education whatsoever. It was just don't do it, basically. Don't have sex. Just wait till you're married. And there was no even education around stuff like puberty. getting your period, dating. There was just no, like, it was just don't do it. When I got to high school, I did start dating somebody. It was like we weren't allowed to be alone together. We always had to be with a group or on a double date or, something like that.
Yeah. Hmm.
But
It's
I did stick around and kiss my boyfriend. So,
it's interesting how often those motifs are very typical of just like, don't do it. By the way, we're not really going to tell you what to do. There's obviously like basic stuff like keep your clothes on. But a lot of people that I've spoken with over the years, they even well into their late teenage years, early adulthood, they didn't really know what the opposite sex looked like naked. Like even in basic pictures or drawings or cartoons or anything, like they just had no clue what the opposite sex looked like. And it's like you, there might be like a happy medium of like maybe we should give kids a little bit of an understanding. And on that note, it's interesting when I was at Bob Jones, uh, I was into ultra purity culture, and I ended up working in their art gallery, which I've since learned is for some reason closed. I don't know if it's permanent or what, but when I was there, it was open and it was a big deal. It was second in value for Western religious art, only to the Vatican. I mean, it was big stuff, and I worked and guarded Rembrandts and these old Baroque paintings. But there was this one gallery I guarded this one time, and it included a Baroque painting of a whole bunch of people, including a topless woman. And I remember asking the curator of the museum at some point, like, how is Bob Jones defending having a painting of it? I know it's hundreds of years old, but still, isn't that kind of pornography? And they were trying to like explain it to me, and my mind was just like blown that this was even an option. That their explanation, like, I was just totally into purity culture at that point. I obviously was desperate to be looking at pictures like that in one sense, but I was also desperate to not look at them because I wanted to stay pure. And so my wheels were going crazy, but I don't remember exactly how they defended it, but something about there's like a fine line of appropriate fine art, and the Baroque era, being that it's like hundreds of years ago, is kind of in that vicinity, but you wouldn't want to obviously push it much further than that. But it's interesting conversations.
it is so interesting. And when you really get into it, like purity culture, the way that basic normal human desires are demonized and used to guilt and shame you, I think it's such a huge part of the religious trauma piece, is because we're all born humans. Like we have sexual desires, we have those, that's just part of our biology. Like that's how the human race goes on. And what they're actually asking you to do is to deny your humanness and feel bad every time that you act like a human. And it's like, how can you be anything but what you are? And yet you're born to be this human, and yet also you're born to, they're making you feel horrible about being this human, right? And these are normal things, but I did not know that when I was a young, middle schooler having unpure thoughts. I thought, I am evil. God can see my thoughts. I'm probably not even a Christian because I'm having these thoughts. Like I wrestled with it. It was one of the hardest things. Finally, getting to be into my 30s probably before I really let go of some of that shame.
Yeah, it is. It's very intense, and I can second that in the sense that when I was at these Bible colleges, there'd be private conversations very often with the other, preacher boys. We called preacher boys at Bob Jones. I guess we're pastoral students at LBC, but this idea of like the accountability, that was a buzzword. Like, are you accountable to somebody? Are you accountable probably at first to like an older, established elder or pastor in the church, but then secondarily, are you accountable to your peers? And the accountability, of course, always came down to pornography and masturbation. But you'd realize like some of these guys, they're like halfway through or three-quarters of the way through their education. They might go into seminary, but like a lot of these churches will accept you with a bachelor's degree in pastoral ministry. They're
Mhm.
expecting to go out and apply for churches within the next year. And some of these guys, it was either I'm married or I'm about to get married, maybe not married, but I'm about to get married so I can have endless sex with my wife. And so the sex problem, if I had a pornography issue, I can just, obviously release whenever I want to with her. And that fixes it. Or I'm single with no prospects, meaning like I really need to find a wife, or else I need to keep this under wraps. Like I'm really struggling with this part of my life. And you're thinking these are people that are going to be expounding the word of God to people 10, 20, 30, 40 years their senior. And you just get to that point where you think, if the search committee for these churches looking for pastors really knew what you were telling me and these other guys in these private accountability groups, they'd be like, you're not what we're looking for. You're not pure enough. And so it becomes very much this, we keep it our secret in our little groups, but we don't really broadcast this, even though everyone probably knows in the back of their mind it's going on. We don't talk about it because it's just, you have to keep that facade up. And I think that carries over, obviously, not just pastoral students, but to all of us, anybody, especially if you're on stage somewhere in the church, like, you have to keep up this facade. And it puts people in this double life where you're like, I'm one person up front and I'm one person in real life, and never the twain shall meet. And you end up at a point where you just like, I'm a faker. My spiritual life is fake, and I know it, but I can't tell anybody because I'll lose everything at that point.
You know, that feeling of being an imposter, and always, like, I had that feeling a lot because I was always pretending that I didn't doubt, pretending that I 100% believed all these things, so much that I would lead other people into it. But even while I was doing that, I was thinking, yeah, but part of you doesn't even believe this yourself, you know? And then here you are on this side telling people they need to do this because that's what's expected. That's the facade. And then on the other part, you're like, but maybe it's all, crap. And I don't even know. And, there's just sort of I guess, almost like you got to disassociate pieces. This is that piece over here, and then a hard line, and then here's this piece over here,
Yeah. Did you ever find anybody in your family or circle of friends that you could confide in, before the full official deconstruction period?
So I'm really grateful. I had a brother. So I'm the second oldest. I have 3 younger brothers and 1 older sister. My sister was very on task with everything, like followed everything my parents wanted her to do. And then my brother next to me in age was like my best friend. And he and I actually had created this sort of a pact between us where everything was safe to talk about. And we would be able to sit, we would be outside of the earshot of my parents, usually like outside. And we were free to discuss whether there was a God or not, or whether they really believed mom and dad, or what maybe there is a God, but is this the right religion or right interpretation? And we were able to go there with that and discuss it. And he's now an atheist. So, it was like we helped each other. I really think we helped each other a lot.
Wow, that's amazing. That's so cool. I could have ached for that myself at certain seasons of my questioning. That's awesome. I did want to just ask too, is maybe to steer it back. I know I've asked you a lot of questions here, and I hope I haven't steered us too far away from your story. But going back to your story, maybe picking it up in your teenage years, like what were some of the experiences that you had, that were, I guess, 2 sides of it. What were the experiences that kind of pulled you back and said, no, this is real. There's a God. Look, there's a miracle. This family, they were about to divorce and God brought them together. This person supposedly had cancer and now he's cured or whatever. It's in remission. There's God working in ways. And, the missions you talked about, there's missionary stories. This whole tribe came to the Lord. What do you say about that? Alcoholics that are no longer, they're free now. And Jesus saved them from alcoholism. God is clearly doing miracles. He's clearly doing work. He's clearly changing lives and rescuing families from sin. And those kind of experiences, like, which ones pulled you in to say, no, I guess I'm safe here. My questions will dissolve. I'll be okay with God. And at the same time, what were the antagonism questions that kind of said, no, you need to keep exploring here?
So I'd say there was just a constant doubt living in the back of my mind, but it would sometimes get, like you said, sort of assuaged to say, no, really, this is good. Look at, like, one time I remember we grew up very poor. First of all, money was always tight and was always a struggle. But I remember there was a time when my parents just didn't have enough money to pay the mortgage. And they were praying to God, God, help us. And somehow they ended up getting an unexpected check in the mail for the exact amount that they needed. Right. And so that felt like, oh, wow, like that's God, right? Because how else could that have happened? Um, and then, other things like that would happen where it just felt like that couldn't be a coincidence. That had to be God.
The George
Um,
Mueller kind of stories. Yeah.
mhm. And then, and as a young child and as a believer, I think you tend to believe stuff like that a little more easily. Just like kids believe in Santa and the Tooth Fairy pretty easily too, right? Because they don't have a lot of life experience to compare it to. But then I would see things, or I would see what I saw a lot was hypocrisy. Like I would see a preacher getting up and preaching about, oh, God loves everybody and this and that. But then after church, that same preacher will be sitting around telling racist jokes with each other and laughing. And that got to me. I'd be like, wait a second, you know, you say, I would hold them to a standard that I would expect of a teacher or a preacher or a leader. And then I would see them just act like, a jerk or, be cruel or arrogant or, racist. And my inner scales were being thrown off balance, where I'd be like, now I don't know if I should believe what you were saying in front of the congregation. I guess I was kind of like one of those kids that just I wanted to get to the truth. I wanted to get to the bottom. And I remember I used to pray, like, God, if you're real, like, just show me one sign, like anything, like, just show me something that says, like, definitely, definitely, I'm real and I'm here. And I would, like that story in the Bible where he lays out that guy in the Old Testament, like, lays out the fleece and it gets
Gideon.
wet.
Yeah.
Remember that? So
Yeah.
I was hoping for some sign like that, like anything. And I was begging constantly, like, God, if you're real, just show me like one thing that will end all my doubt. And then I can just know for sure, like, yep, God, threw a lightning bolt down or whatever it was that I can just rest my faith in and just know. And I never, nothing like that ever happened.
Hmm. It's interesting how that works. And I would just add before you answer the other part of like what were some of the other things that kept you in and things that pulled you out, but just to give a reflection on what you just said, I think the thing that transformed me in the sense of keeping me in, the best illustration I could use is, the Matrix movie,
Mhm.
the first one, when he's shot towards the very end, there was like 2 minutes left in the movie, he's shot and it looks like he's dead. And then he gets up. But when he gets up at that moment, they show like what he's seeing. And instead of him seeing the hallway and the building and the agents, he's seeing the green code of the Matrix.
Mhm.
And even though that's a great illustration of seeing past Christianity, once you kind of wake up from, the Christian indoctrination, like, oh, this is just green code and this isn't real. Jesus is real. It's a good illustration at the same time of what it can feel like when you're in Christianity and you're doubting and you're looking for all these answers, like, where are you? What's going on here? And then suddenly he kind of, it's more like he shows you that he's everywhere. And all of a sudden you're not looking for this miracle of, oh, he cured this person of cancer. It's like, do you not understand the stars, the fact that they exist, the fact that people are born, the fact that your heart's still working, everything is a miracle. And you begin to kind of like slowly tweak your vision. And it's as if the walls are the code of the matrix of God. And you just see God everywhere. And especially when
Mhm.
you're I was in a background where evolution was highly not taught. It was like evolution is complete garbage and it's of the devil. Therefore, because evolution as a concept is fundamentally flawed, the opposite would be God is very specific. He doesn't do anything by accident. He's not rolling the dice and hoping the universe turns out. He's specifically doing things to illustrate either his character or what heaven is going to be like or something aspect of his kingdom or of your salvation. So I was always looking for, God, why did you do this in creation? Like, what does this say? Not just about your glory and your power, but what does this say about your character and your nature and about your plan of salvation for us? And I was always looking, and I felt like every time I come up with some beautiful illustration, like, oh, that illustrates salvation so well. And of course, the Bill Gothard character sketches and all that stuff. They come into some of that equation, but you're seeing God more and more everywhere. And eventually it's like every minute, every breath is that miracle that you wanted. Every moment you're saying, God, where are you? You just suddenly see him. Like you're looking at the walls. I'm looking at my walls now to illustrate. Like you look at the walls and you're like, I can see you everywhere. Not in some panentheism sense, but just I see your handiwork everywhere. And the fact that you're touching my heart and you're saying, Tim, fight your sin, fight for the gospel, fight for the lost. They need to be saved. I'd be like, that's a miracle. It's natural for me to want to just sin and say, screw you to God and the things of the Lord. He is rejuvenating my heart every minute of the day. That's evidence of the miracle. It's not, you don't need to have a dead body that's raised from the dead. Your heart was raised from the dead. That's your evidence. And that evolved to a point in my heart of just like, whoa, God, you're everywhere. This whole thing is so beautiful that I felt like I was kind of answering my question and at the same time pushing those questions of God, can you speak to me? Pushing them aside enough by saying, this is the answer. He has put your heart on fire for heaven and the kingdom. That's God. If you wanted to conjure that yourself, you couldn't do it, but the Holy Spirit can do it. That's your evidence. That's him talking. That's him proving himself. And that got me through for a lot longer than it should have. That got me through. And that was my philosophical answer to these conundrums, if that makes sense.
No, it does, yeah. And it's funny how we'll go to almost like mental gymnastics to keep that illusion going as long as you can. Because what's on the other side is scary. I actually, when I started to deconstruct, I would try to close my eyes and think of one thing I believed in, and I couldn't, it would just felt like a black hole. I didn't know what was true. I didn't know what I was or who I was or what the world was or what anything, any religion, any God, like none of it made any sense to me. And that was that's what I think is that's what I think keeps people from leaving a lot, is that it's scary. We don't know what's on the other side.
Was as you wrapped up the time where you were more seriously in Christianity, was there ever a time where you just kind of got to a place of peace, or did the peace just simply never come?
Yeah, I would say I had times where I was able to sort of just push down my doubts or push down my, worries and just say, no, like you were saying, I'm so grateful. This is, we found the one true religion, and that I was born into this, American family. That was really pushed too, was like we're so grateful because we're Americans and we were born into, this version of Christianity, and that we were taught about God from the very beginning. Like that was always cast in this really like, you're so privileged, like. And so that's sort of one of the ways I would use to soothe myself, would be like, yeah, but we're so lucky, we have, somehow luckily managed to arrive in this little, one small, like interpretation, one small sect of this larger thing. And we got it right. We got everything right, and how lucky is that? But then later in life, that's the exact thing that was unraveling my faith too, was like, wait a second, how is it that everyone else is wrong? There's billions of people out there, and the people that we, even you can't just take Christianity, you have to take it in, slice it up further and further and further, because the Lutherans didn't get it right. The Methodists didn't get it right. The Mormons didn't get it right. We got it right. Like how many people got it right? And that's one thing, I even write about this in my book, that I was always asking my parents things like, who's gonna actually be kicked out of heaven? What about the Protestants? What about the Catholics? Are they, like, what makes, even if they believe in Jesus, that's not good enough. I couldn't wrap my head around all the little specifics. And then it started to really come back to me that like, maybe everyone's right. I don't know, So I don't know. That was part of my unraveling, was realizing how very small this privileged, saved world was compared to the huge world out there.
I think too, acknowledging eventually that other people are feeling the exact same way, that they're like, how are we so privileged to be Muslims growing up with this beautiful Quran and the right interpretation of it, or the right Buddhists? And yeah,
Mhm.
it's you realize everybody's saying the same thing, and of course, a lot of them are also saying the same thing about the out group, saying you're all going to go to hell. No, you are. No, you are. And it's like eventually you realize we're all saying very similar things from different perspectives, and it's been interesting to me to see that in interpersonal relationships, that a lot of the things that we all accuse each other of, we're saying the same words. We're just saying it from the opposite perspective, obviously. I'm right. I've got the right interpretation. You're going to go to hell, and I'm saying the other person's saying the same exact thing. And I think that when you really do what's, I love John Loftus's work about what he calls the outsider test for faith, where you kind of say, if you'd never heard of this religion before, you'd never, like, you grew up completely agnostic, and you somehow had just been in some kind of philosophical cultural bubble, and you had just never heard a word about Jesus, and you grew up and you're now 20, 25, and the first that you finally hear about it, and it's like, oh, what's this? And you think through it, what would you perceive? Like, what would be your first perceptions about this worldview, this belief system? And to realize all these questions will come up, like, but how do you know that the right books got in the Bible? How do you know that they were preserved correctly? How do you know that this elder
Mhm.
from 250 AD didn't pop a few extra words in and take a few other words out? How do you know for sure? And how do we know we're interpreting it correctly, being that it's gone from many ways, of course, Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin, and into eventually into obviously other languages and in English. There's all these translations. How do you know which one is really the best one? And what if there's like one chapter or one verse, and it ends 10 different ways there's different manuscripts? How do you know which one is the right one? We know for sure there's like at least, what, 9 different endings of the Gospel of Mark. And how
Mhm.
do you know that there's 4 gospels? We know that there are originally like 60 and possibly hundreds. Why did these 4 get in? And you start to step back and like, oh, yeah, these questions were just like, you just had all this assumption. Like, I just assumed that we got it right. And of course, I'm sure the Muslims, I'm sure we got the right verses in the Quran. And once you step back from that, you're like, our assumptions are a little bit too assuming, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Like I remember that reminds me of this time I sat in a chapel service in high school, or maybe, yeah, it was like I was a teenager, and the preacher was preaching about the sin of homosexuality, and he was like, that was the main topic of his sermon, and he was using the Bible verses in Leviticus, about if a man lays with another man, he deserves death, or like I can't remember all the exact wording, but and like I started thumbing through because I was kind of bored, and I started thumbing through the book of Leviticus, reading other verses, right? And I thought, and I remember just the thought occurred to me of, why do we just pick this one verse? There's they say it's okay to like stone your children to death if they lie. It's okay to sell your children into slavery if you can't take care of them. It's okay to, all these things, but we've cherry picked out of that same book. We just, the one about the, men laying with men or whatever. And I just started really thinking about it. Like, there's so many things in the Bible. Women have to wear hats in church, or, to sin, to go into a place of worship with your head uncovered. Everything just felt so arbitrary all of a sudden to me. And I just realized how there's this Bible that they say is the complete holy word of God, blah, blah, blah. But also some of these verses don't apply to us anymore. And we've decided which ones apply to us now, our current modern day church, and which ones we can safely discard. And it's like, again, if you're not getting direct communication from God, who's deciding what's in and what's out? And that
Yeah.
was just a big thought for me. And I'm sitting there in church, having this thought of like, wow, it's so weird that we've just picked this and not that, and this and not that. And everyone just goes with it.
Yeah, and often that's chalked up to, oh, it's, law versus grace, but then Hebrews talks about Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So it's like, if Yahweh commanded genocide, land theft, and slavery, and child brides and stoning, then Jesus did too. He's this, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and I don't change. So that's Yahweh. That's Jesus. They're doing the same thing. They're commanding these horrible things, and yeah, when you put those pieces together like that, it eventually is like, this is really weird that And Jesus, the way he's presented often is like, I'm in contrast to Moses. Moses said this, but I say this. Like, no, Moses didn't say that. Moses took down your words. You said that the first time. Moses was just quoting you. It wasn't Moses, it was you. And so that stuff bothered me so much. I struggled so much, and I had all kinds of cognitive dissonance on that topic alone of like, how do you explain the fact that Jesus seems to be correcting Moses when Jesus was the one who gave the law in the first place? He could have just given us the grace message the way he wanted it right from the start through Moses, or just he could have just come back in the time of the Exodus. He could have led the people out of Egypt, and he could have given the gospel right then and there, and just this is it. This is the way of salvation. But this whole contrast, yeah, so many issues like that just blow up in your face as when you really admit that there's some issues here. You mentioned that this was starting to fall apart for you. At what age did the sort of intellectual anxiety of this sort of go into overdrive, where you're just like, oh, I can't hold these two pieces together. Something's wrong here. When did it really hit the point of like no return? I have to find an answer because I can't keep going.
I would say from the time I started, it was a long process. So I would say I was probably 15 or 16 years old when I started really wondering and, allowing myself to toy with the idea of maybe it could not be true, until I actually decided to stop going to church and say, yeah, maybe I'm not a Christian anymore. I was 21. So I would say it was like a 5 to 6 year period where I lived in that really cognitive dissonant world the whole time.
How did your parents respond to you stopping going to church?
Well, they were not happy. They were already unhappy with me by that point because I had ran off and eloped with an older unsaved person as a way to hopefully try to escape myself. It actually ended up being like going from a frying pan into the fire, so they say. But at the time, I thought that was my only option to get out and be free, but it wasn't.
Was the escape over like legalism rules in your family? Like, what was the main motivation to elope and get out?
Yeah, I guess I didn't feel like I could be who I wanted to be. Like, I didn't feel like that they were ever going to allow me to be free. I had experienced their control almost tightening as I got older instead of loosening. Like I was, 19 years old and in college and dating a Christian dude at Bob Jones University who should have been like, yay. And they, again, just control. They said I couldn't date him. They stopped me from seeing my boyfriend like 3,000 miles away from them. And I felt like I was never going to have the freedom to be myself unless I just left. And I was actually afraid if I quit going to Bob Jones that they would like drag me off to some reform, prison camp type situation to kind of scare God into me, or I didn't know. Like I did not feel free whatsoever. And I thought that they did respect marriage though. And I thought that if I got married and I was now someone's wife, they would allow me to be myself.
Yeah.
And, like I said, frying pan to the fire situation, I just traded one abusive, controlling authority figure for another. And then when I left him only a year later, because it was really toxic and abusive, and he was like twice my age. But that's why leaving him was sort of what gave me the permission to leave God as well. I kind of, in my mind, thought there's another controlling asshole I need to leave as well, which is God. And so that was a really big time in my life where I had let my parents down hugely. I had eloped and then I'd gotten divorced, which is a huge no-no. And then I had stopped going to church kind of all in the same year, basically. And I did worry that they were going to just give up on me, and they basically did. So,
In the sense of just like, I guess the devil's got you kind of thing.
mhm. Yep. My mom, she was really devout. When I was 15, what kicked off my like serious deconstruction journey was when I was 15. My mom was kind of bragging to a friend about her prayers. And she was like, every night before I go to bed, I pray that if any of my children should stray from the path of God, that he would just take them home. And I thought about that and I thought, wait a second, is she saying that she prays that we'll die if we don't believe in God anymore? Or if we leave, if we start to do something that would make God look bad. And I could not get that out of my head. I thought over and over again, I thought that goes against every parenting instinct that a normal parent should have, is that you protect your child. You want their life to go on, even if they're disobeying you, even if maybe they're, not living their best life, you still want your child to live. But I couldn't believe my ears. I was hearing my own mom just say, like, yeah, I kind of hope she dies if she doesn't believe in this faith anymore. And I just couldn't wrap my head around that. And then I started to think, what kind of a religion is this? If parents are encouraged to sacrifice their children in the name of their faith, in the name of their belief system.
And when you look at the Bible, some of that stuff is very clear. People could say, "Oh, that was an extreme parenting situation," but it's really not. I mean, when we start with the generic idea that God and Jesus has to rank far above anything else in terms of who we love. Jesus says, "If you don't, love me more than everything else, you're not worthy to be my disciple." And then you have that example of Abraham with Isaac, where God says, "I want you to be willing to sacrifice even your own son," and I mean it. Like, and he didn't tell him, "I'm going to interrupt this at the last minute." Abraham thought, "I need to kill my kid," and he was willing to do it in that story, at least the version we got.
Oh, that story terrified me as a kid, because I would think my parents would do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've even I've seen parents who have said right to their kids' faces, "If I lived in Old Testament times and you were a long-term rebellious child, I would have obeyed Yahweh and stoned you to death." And I've seen that. I've seen those conversations.
Mhm.
It's beyond frightening, and they mean it, because but you understand, in the worldview, you do of course have to rank Yahweh's commands far above anything, even our natural love for our children. And in the trajectory of, like, okay, if your life is like going, and you as a child are going to dishonor God a little bit now, but eventually you're going to make a complete shipwreck of your life and dishonor God a lot, then yeah, I'd rather you take them home, if especially if home is still heaven, if they truly believed. I would rather you take them here before this whole thing is a nasty shipwreck, because they're not just going to make their lives a mess, they're going to make other people stumble in their faith. The most
Mhm.
important thing is to get to heaven. So if my kid can get to heaven by you taking them now, and we can avoid them being an example of, oh, well, look, I bucked God. I told God to I don't care about you anymore, and my life's doing okay, at least on the facade. Then other people might be tempted to also sit and say, "Oh, I'll get away. God can be mocked, I guess." And therefore, you're going to lead other people astray. Just nip it in the bud. Keep everybody on the straight and narrow. It makes sense. It adds up, and it's what's crazy is that it turns you into a monster. And I've used this illustration in other interviews, but I was a Calvinist towards the end of my time, and I went to a Presbyterian church. And I remember this sermon where the pastor's just down the street from me, mega church, but a Presbyterian church. He was concerned that people weren't really understanding, like, even though we're a really big church and we kind of seem seeker sensitive, tongue twister. He said, "We're a Calvinist church." And he used an illustration. He's like, "A woman in our church lost her baby like in the first year, and I counseled this woman, and she was struggling with how to respond to this. God took my baby." And he said, "Ma'am, you're never going to heal unless you get your theology right. The theology is the basis of all true healthiness." And he said, "Ma'am, this is the biblical truth. Your baby deserved to die. We all do. It's a grace of God that you have a breath right this moment. And every sin deserves death. The Bible's very clear about that, Romans 3:23. And so he said this to this whole congregation and repeated it like the very next Sunday. And I remember thinking at the time, that is such a hard message to give to a woman in such grief. But at the same time, I was saying, to my shame, and I readily admit this, to my shame, I said, yeah, that is the right theology. Your baby did deserve to die because everyone deserves to die. You're not
Mm.
promised a day. God gives and takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I admit my theology turned me into a monster. And so I like to say, as like a motif of this channel, if you believe monstrous things long enough, they turn you into a monster. I did it to myself, and I've seen other people do it, and it's so scary when you realize what this stuff does to your morality. It's like, isn't this a moral religion? It's like, actually, it's quite the opposite. It takes your morality and silences it. It kills your humanity.
I couldn't agree more, honestly. Like, there's just, like, you look at the role model of Christianity, which is God. God is angry, vengeful, jealous, wrathful, seemingly arbitrary. Kids die with cancer, kids die in pain, kids are abused. If there's a God, if there's a just God, why is all this stuff happening? That's something I always ask myself. Like, if you believe in God and the little baby got born with leukemia and lived a horrible 2 years and then died, like, how is that link up together with a loving God?
Yeah.
Right. And you wrap your head around this idea that God allowed that to happen. God gave them cancer because he had some, oh, you don't know the way of the Lord, his ways are mysterious and you just have to trust. And it's like, that sounds like a monster to me. If you had the power, if you were totally the most powerful being and you knew everything and you knew there was someone suffering and you did nothing, that's cruel, right?
Mm.
Like, either God's an asshole or God doesn't exist, and there's really no in between.
Yeah.
That's the conclusion I came to, anyways.
Mm. What was the first approximate, like how old were you approximately when you first kind of said those words to yourself in your head or out loud to say, I'm I'm not debating anymore. I'm out. Like, I don't think this stuff is real. How old were you? How long ago was that?
It was sometime in my 20s. It was such a slow process. I can't say that I just woke up one day and said, okay, this is it.
Yeah.
It was more like every day a little piece of rice would get pulled out of the bin until one day all the rice was gone. And I realized I didn't believe in God anymore.
Hmm. It's a great illustration. What was the first time you actually admitted this stuff to your family? And how did those conversations go?
Well, this is a good story. My mom came to visit me up here. I was living in Estes Park. I had just started the deconstruction process. I had just gotten divorced and I was trying to, kind of get my life back on track a little bit. And she came out to visit because we were still on visiting speaking terms at that time. And I think really she was coming to check on me and make sure that I was still on the straight and narrow. So she showed up and I had my eyebrow pierced. I had a poster of Bob Marley on my wall, and I was living in a cabin shared with my friend and her boyfriend. And so everything about my situation, she was unhappy with. Like, she showed up and she's like, what did you do to your face? Why are you living with a guy and a couple that's not married? Why do you have a poster of a guy with long hair on your wall that's not Jesus? um, and then, and I just kind of was like, oh, yeah, it's just reggae music, mom, or whatever. And then we went out to eat at a restaurant where I worked at the time. And she said, so have you been witnessing to your coworkers? And it just, like, the question was so weird to me. But then I realized, like, that was coming from her context and my old context. And it made perfect sense to her. And so I kind of just looked at her and I said, witnessing? And she's like, yeah, like sharing your beliefs. And I said, Mom, what makes you think that we have it right? Like, I'm not going to share what I don't even know is true with someone. And And she just kind of looked like I'd slapped her. Like she realized that was the moment when she realized that I was no longer really a Christian.
Mm.
And I wasn't even rude about it. I just kind of was like, what? Why would I do that? You know, like I don't believe it myself. Why would I tell someone else, like, hey, this is the one true path?
So you put her in emergency mode, obviously. Was she at that
Mhm.
point just upset and walking away? Did she try to, bring the conversation quickly back to the gospel and try to resave you?
Yeah, so she kind of just ignored, like she shifted the topic right then. And then I decided to be a real rebel and order a beer right in front of her.
For a
Because I knew,
Baptist, that's rebel.
oh, I knew she would be very upset. And then as soon as I ordered the beer, she was done and she went back to check into our hotel. She didn't even want to sit there and watch me drink a beer. So I said, all
Well,
right, I'll see you later.
kudos to you for taking your power. That's awesome.
Yep.
At
Yep.
a certain
And
point,
then,
it's time to pull the plug, and I give you my applause.
yep. And I'm sure she went home and there was like a emergency prayer meeting held on my behalf. And it was shortly, maybe a year or two after that, I got an email from my mom that said basically that she didn't say she was giving up on me. She said she was giving me up to my sins. And basically she was kind of just cutting me off from her love, affection, attention, anything. She just said, here's all the ways that you have gone wrong. You did this, you did this, you did this, you did this. So I'm giving you up.
Mm. And that's,
And
I think, a reference to probably a couple of verses, but the one that comes to mind is that I think First Corinthians, where Paul talks about this sinner in the church that's unrepentant. He uses the expression, I Paul have given them over to Satan, and so should you, with this idea of like you're going to basically punish him as severely as you can, but it's with this one good little goal. They're going to hate their human life. They're going to hate how bad life is getting because their community is ostracizing them and so forth. But you're actually going to save their soul because they're going to be so sick of the ramifications, the negative ramifications of what their sin has produced. Like you thought this sin was wonderful and you realize you just injected poison into your spirit and now you're sick as a dog and you're going to regret it. You're going to regret this poison that you've taken and you're so arrogant about it. And then you're going to be begging for help and your begs are eventually going to be begging God, please rescue me. I am the prodigal son. I need to go back to you. But to turning over to Satan and turning over to your flesh and to your, and you get that message too in the Old Testament with God. It's almost like he's taking Israel collectively as if it was one person, shaking them. Why are you intent on dying? Like, I want to save you. Let me save you. Why? And it's just like, God, let me go. I'm walking away. And he's like, I've asked you 1,000 times, please don't go into death. If this is really what you want, go. I'll let you eventually go do your stuff. And that the fact that, again, parents, going back to the whole Abraham sacrificing Isaac thing, you really lose your humanity in this religion. You really do.
you really do. Absolutely. I think we become so disconnected from our self, our true self, our human self. And we become almost like these monstrous versions, like we're supposed to be like God. But when you really get down to it, that's not a good role model. That's not someone you want to be like. I I don't, after I found everything out. And like I actually tried really hard to stay in the religion. Like when I started the deconstructing process, I kept trying to convince myself that, maybe I just didn't have the right information. And so I started to go into like really deep research on my own of the history of Christianity. Like I went back and studied about the Council of Nicaea, where they determined which books of the Bible would go in. And all along, I just wanted to follow the path of how we got here from there. And I probably almost put myself through like seminary or something, just trying to figure out if this was possible to be true. And what frustrated me was that I would have these family members, like my whole entire family is in the Christian faith, except for my one brother that got out. But my grandpa would even, send me tracts, religious literature. Sarah, I think if you just read the Bible again with your adult mind, read this book, read this book, read this tract, I think you'll come around to it. And I kind of had to keep saying, I have all the information. Believe me, I am reading the Bible and every other book that I can find about the Bible because I want to know. But the more I look, the more information I get, the less I believe.
Hmm. What a great way to put it. I love it. When you mentioned your grandfather talking about, like, if you just look at it again with your adult mind, it's funny. I almost feel like I asked that same question in reverse, not direct, like actually, but like in my own mind, I just think now that you Christians or you've been in it for 20, 30, 40 years or more, like, can you just do a little reflection? Do you really, really think, and I'm just going to go to some basic, obvious stuff, but like, do you really think there's a God who said, I want you to cut off the end of little boys' penises? Like, really? Like, that alone is like, you really think there's a God that he designed this whole beautiful universe, and he could have made that baby boy exactly the way he wanted without a foreskin, but he's going to
Mhm.
make the foreskin, and then when the baby's 8 days old, he's going to make you chop it off and make that baby scream in terror. Like, you really think that God is real, and you really think that God couldn't have made it clear? Do you use the Masoretic text or the other texts to translate the Old Testament and for Jesus
Mhm.
to quote from? And do you really think this and that? And you just get to a point where you just wonder, why can't they see it? And it's a testament to the power of indoctrination when you get to a certain level. And it's also, I think, the sunk cost issue of, like, I've
Mhm.
put 40, 50, 60 years into this. If you're telling me that maybe I was wrong this whole time, then you're basically saying you've basically wasted your whole life. Unless you're lucky and live to 120 or something. If you're in your 60s, 70s or more, and you've given your life passionately to Christ, then you're saying, I've lived my whole life. Like, I basically have never lived a day of my life yet. And my life's almost over. And the terror of that, and the terror, of course, mixed into, like, I thought I was going to see grandma so-and-so who's already on the banks of Jordan. I'm not going to see her. What are you talking about? My whole fervor and expectation is I will see my loved ones. And of course, more importantly, I will see my Lord and Savior. I'll see him face to face, and I'll be like him and glorified, and life will be forever. And all of a sudden you're going to say that's not even real. The terror of these implications is just too much, and they can't deal with it. But it it baffles my mind. And even I'd mentioned this sometimes jokingly too, but the Lord's table, like, you really think there's a God who wants you to pretend every week or month, he wants you to pretend to eat a dead man's body and to drink a dead man's blood? Like, you really think that? And you're oblivious to the fact that they were already doing that with other religions hundreds of years before this. And
Mhm.
it's, I sometimes wonder, and I'm not going to make this a conjecture where I think this is really happening. I just wonder sometimes if some people, if you could really see in their heart of hearts that it's just more cultural, that they're afraid of homosexuality, they're afraid of culture changing, they're used to growing up the way they grew up and the way their daddy grew up and his daddy grew up, and they're used to this is my life and it feels normal, and I just, every life's changing too much and I've got to cling to something. But I know a lot of people don't know the mythology stuff, but when I look at some of these Bible scholars at Bible college I went to in seminary, I've got to believe that some of them who are just studying their night and day, they love to learn, that some of them are coming across the information. Like, for me, for example, just to give a quick list, I learned that the book of Enoch is quoted 200 times in the New Testament. Like, when were you all going to tell me that? And, like,
Mhm.
Dionysius turns water into wine and he rides into town on a donkey. So does Jesus. Helios, the sun god, wears a purple robe and he has the crown of the sun raised around his head. Jesus, purple robe, crown of thorns. Um, Hermes, the Flash, walks across the water with his golden slippers. Jesus walks across the water. Zeus cries tears of blood and water. Then Jesus does. Like, at some point, you got to admit, and we could go on for hours on that. Like, at some point, you have to admit, this, you didn't tell us this stuff, number one, but this stuff sounds a little fishy. And
Mhm.
I've got to wonder if some of these Bible scholars know, and they're just, if I open my mouth, I'm going to lose my job, lose my marriage, lose my everything. And so I'm just going to keep it shut and act like this is all irrelevant when it's, and that maybe they know it's actually quite relevant, and this would destroy your faith. So instead of sharing it with you and let you decide, I'm just going to shut up and act like it's not there. You know?
Yeah, I do wonder if you could know somehow, like what percentage of believers out there actually have deconstructed, but they're just faking it so they don't lose everything.
Yeah, that's very
That
true.
would be an interesting question. And I think about that, like my parents, they've been in the ministry actively converting souls to Christ for, what, 45, 50 years or something, like long time. And at this point, yeah, like their whole life would have been wasted and been alive. They suddenly decide, like, oh, yeah, this isn't true. So there's a lot of incentive. The longer you're in something, the harder it is to bow out gracefully, right?
Mm.
And so I think about that. Like at one point, I was able to shift my anger at my parents into compassion, where I really felt like I was mad at them for indoctrinating us and for making us feel all this, guilt and fear and shame and worry and, the sin and death and hell and rapture and everything that I thought about and mulled over and was traumatized by. At first, I was angry at them. I'll just be honest, like I was mad. But then the more I got into it, I realized that I felt sorry for them more than anything, because I have the ability to change my belief at any time. And anytime I encounter new information that makes sense to me, I'm allowed to just change my belief. And I'm free. And I feel like they are actually truly in bondage to their beliefs and they're never getting out.
Mm. What a That was one of the best ways I could have ever heard it put. That's just so on target, so poignant. And yeah, you feel grieved because you realize that some of them, they're just not. I mean, we obviously could always say, well, you might make it out, but we know that the percentages wise, there's a lot of them that will never make it out, and it's so grievous, and especially when they're not just not going to make it out, but they're going to go to their end of their days knowing that they know that they know that they know that you're on your way to hell, and they're okay with that. They're going to go to heaven in their mind and praise the Lord, and they're going to be okay eternally singing blissful songs of their salvation to Jesus while you're in extreme torture forever, and that they're okay with that. And that, again, the loss of their humanity and basic civility and empathy, it's so crazy. But I love that you're pointing out that it goes from this anger and this grief to, I'm just sorry for you. I wish you could see what I see. I know you can't, but I'm not, like, I know, because we've been in it. Like, I know what it feels like to be on your side. I know what it feels like to know that there's no truth but the Bible truth. And now that I'm on the other side, I can't unsee what I've seen, but I know where you're coming from. And gosh, I wish I could give you a vision for what I see, but I know I can't. And therefore I know this relationship is pretty much a goner for perhaps the rest of my life. And that stinks. That really stinks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And I've been, I tried until for about 20 years, I tried to keep my relationship with my family and keep following my own journey. But 7 years ago, I had to just realize that it was pointless and it was hurtful and I needed to let it go. And so I've been, fully estranged from everyone except two of my brothers. So, and then I
Mm.
did it for my own self so I could heal. And it was just too painful and hurtful to see how differently I was treated all the time and how the only interest they had in connecting with me was to try to save me.
Yeah.
So I just said, well, I don't want, that's not the relationship I want. I want to be your daughter. I want to be your sister. I want to be your granddaughter or whatever. But all you do is look at me and see unsaved.
Yeah. Mm. So heartbreaking. I was curious, and kind of starting to steer us towards some final questions. As you reflect on all this, and you've gone through so much. Obviously, I want to talk about your book in a minute too, but you've had your memoirs in your head. You've put some of them into paper for the world to hear. Obviously, I'm sure you'd wish that your parents would see that and respect it, see an interview like this and respect it. But at the end of the day, there's so much pain. And in addition to the pain of just the situation that you described, there's also this overarching struggle that we all have. And I think you alluded to it earlier a little bit, but that it's not just the broken relationships that we face as a result of deconversion, but this theology, the worm theology, that you're a sinner, you deserve badness, or you deserve a bad outcome, or punishment, and God sees in your head and he's constantly judging you. You're just bad, 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 bad. That you don't feel safe in your own skin. You feel like everything you do is you're just never good enough. It's a constant message of you've never been good enough, you never will be good enough. And there's these messages mixed in, like God loves you, but if you don't do it his way, the love actually kind of deflates and turns into hate. I mean, it says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And obviously, hell is an eternal punishment. It's a place of eternal torture. Hatred mixed in with that, like God kind of loves you, but he kind of hates you. And when you look at that and you finally escape, there's still these messages of I don't feel good enough. Like I don't feel safe anymore. I feel like, and it carries into I think our relationships where we're not necessarily
Mhm.
intending to, but we're looking at romantic relationships and even friendships where we're looking at other people to finally affirm us and say, you know what, you're awesome just the way you are. You don't have to jump through hoops. I love and accept you unconditionally. And it's like we're programmed to say, I don't speak that language. I don't speak the language of unconditional love because God's technically unconditional love has always had a million conditions. And I can't feel love anymore. Like, how did you learn to start to heal that? And of course, first to love yourself, which is a huge
Mhm.
factor in this. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to hate yourself in many ways. How did
Exactly.
you learn to love yourself, and then to not, bring some of this worldview stuff into your, friendships and relationships?
Well, honestly, it's only been recently that I've been able to heal that part of myself. I've said it that I think fundamentalist Christianity sets people up for abusive relationships because the model itself is abusive. And so you're either going to end up in the role of abuser or abusee in whatever relationship you enter until you're healed. Um, you're going to take on one side of that. And so what I ended up doing was, as I said, I fell right into a marriage with a very toxic person. First thing that I did right out of the gate, just boom. And then I tried to work on healing myself without therapy, but I did like start doing meditation and I was reading all these books and I started to feel like I was, healing that part of me. And then I chose another toxic, abusive partner. And so when I ended up leaving my second marriage, but basically the same marriage to the same person, it was just two different people. Um, then I realized that I needed help. So I went to therapy and I was diagnosed with PTSD. So there's like a thing called complex PTSD, which comes from like a lifetime of little traumas that build up to the point to where you just can't cope anymore. And that's where I was at. Like I was not coping and I was not healthy. And I've been going to trauma therapy for 4 years now. And the therapist just told me I'm graduating because all my symptoms have gone, I'm like life is manageable again. And what's been interesting is in the therapy sessions, what a lot of times ends up coming up as the core root behind it all is the Christian beliefs that were drilled into me as a child about you're bad, you're unworthy, all love is conditional, like everything that is still 40 years later, still affecting my life until I was able to get it out with trauma therapy.
Hmm. Been an
And
amazing
I think
journey.
I think
Wow.
it's abuse. Like raising children in a fundamentalist environment is abuse. Like
Yeah.
I will stand on that hill and die on it. But
Yeah.
that's why I'm so grateful. And then you can talk about this too as a parent, but that's why I'm so grateful I got a chance to raise my kids outside of that. And they they believe that they are worthy of love. They are shown unconditional love. And no matter what, even if they went off and did something I did not agree with, was not happy with, I would never stop loving them. And I would never stop trying to support them. So
Hmm.
it's just fun to be able to like do it yourself in the way that you wish you had been raised.
Yeah. And it's funny, I've said this before, but we used to talk sometimes in my circles about generational curses. We didn't go as far as like the Pentecostals did, but we would still use the phraseology a little bit, more about divorce. Like, there's been divorce in that generation. That's like, stop it, no more divorce. Like we're marrying for life. But I know Pentecostals use it a little bit more in the demonic world kind of stuff. But when you escape Christianity and you deconvert and go through this process, you realize that even though there's not an actual thing as generational curses, that if we can borrow that phraseology and use it for what happened to us, like there was this generational curse of sorts, and it's Christianity. And
Mhm.
breaking generational curses, the biggest generational curse is to escape mythology. Christianity is mythology, and it's obviously very toxic, like you just talked about. And to give people that freedom to say, there's a whole new life on the other side of this. What a beautiful thing. And I'm cheering you on inside as you talk about your kids, because I mean that's where this is at, because our time is limited. We can't hit the reset button and go back as much as we wish we could to have a childhood where at age 5 we're not threatened with hell and you're bad. We have to deal with where we're at in our lives and our ages, and just make the best of our time. But we want to give our kids a better shot at this life than we did. And what a
Mhm.
beautiful thing to see it in real time and think, wow, like they live their lives and they're getting messages constantly of, I'm awesome, I'm amazing, there's nobody looking inside my head. If your sexuality, when that comes up eventually, that's a normal part of life and it's beautiful. If you end up being a homosexual, you're not going to be judged, we're not going to kick you out of the home, we're going to love you, like all
Yeah.
this stuff. And it's just like, wow, like what a beautiful gift to give to the next generation. It brings tears to your eyes almost, to think of like what a beautiful thing to pass on. And I love it. I'm applauding you and cheering you on from here.
Mm. Thanks. Yeah, it is. It's pretty great. And
Mm,
just knowing that they don't have to have all that trauma to carry into their adulthood with them.
yeah. Well, could I ask, just maybe as a wrap up, uh, end where we started? In your bio, we talked about you being an author and this memoir. Could you take us through kind of what, before you wrote it, what prompted you to think it's time to write it? And if someone were to pick it up, what would they see besides what we've kind of touched on? I'm sure in some ways lightly for some of these topics, but what would they see as they pick this up and hear more of your story?
Sure. So, I think I felt since I was a teenager and started to unravel all this, there was some part in the back of my mind that was like, this would make a good story. I had a pretty unusual childhood, being raised like a little house on the prairie in the 80s in Utah as a preacher's daughter, try to convert the Mormons. And, we were like gardening and hunting, and like all of our food came from the land. And, just kind of a really unique, I guess, childhood. And so I thought, this would be kind of a cool story. And then as I got older and started really hard deconstructing, I thought maybe the story is supposed to be about losing my faith somehow, like here's how it started. And then I realized too that part of it is I had all these memories that I didn't want to lose. They were my childhood, they were my history. And part of the like part of deconstructing is letting go of my past memories, but I was afraid to lose them. I don't know if that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
started to think of my memoir as almost like a snow globe that I could look inside and see these things that I would never be able to touch or hold again. Like I'd lost my family, I'd lost my childhood essentially, but here was a way to preserve it and be able to look back on. And some of my memories are sweet and some of them are funny and playful. Like I do a lot of storytelling. It's really a story is what it is. I don't preach about why I thought this or why I did that. Like I'm just in the moment, in the memoir. I'm 4 years old. I'm 6 years old thinking this thought. I'm 8 years old having this desire that's bad, or like so I guess if you were to pick it up, you would probably feel like you were just coming along with me on my just deconstruction journey, starting from when I was a young girl trying to please God, trying to please my parents, all the way till I was leaving my marriage and saying, yeah, I need to say screw you to this other controlling guy in my life too. So it's a journey that you go on. And, I'm not trying to deconvert anyone. It's more like if you want to see the thought process of why I ended up deconverting from my religion. Maybe someone that's a Christian will want to read it so they can figure out how to witness to people better, or who knows, right?
Mm, that's awesome. You're a little bit more gracious about it than I am. I like to say if I put 1,000 people in the kingdom, I want to take 100,000 back out. I am actively trying to deconvert people.
I would not be sad if someone read it and decided, yeah, she's made some good points and maybe I'm going to start deconverting too. But that's really not, the point of it.
Right.
I really was writing it for one, my own healing, two, to preserve those memories, three, to maybe help people that have been there and maybe didn't even realize that they've been there until they read the book and like, oh, I've been there.
Mm. I think what's awesome too about that dynamic is that a couple of things. Number one, people might just relate to your story so much better than someone else. Maybe just they'll see your picture and just the way you look or the way you sound, your background, where you grew up. They'll just be like be able to relate to certain parts of your journey and just feel like you're aligned. But also just the idea of you being able to effectively through that book say, I'm taking my voice back. Like this is a way of saying my voice isn't, I'm not going to go out of this as some kind of victim. Like I started as a victim. Yes, I do have trauma and it's severe in some ways, but that the final word in this story is not the trauma. The final word is I'm a victor and I'm going to make something beautiful out of these ashes. And of course, it has nothing to do with Jesus or Yahweh. I want to make something beautiful out of this story. And that's so amazing. That's so beautiful. And I think I've heard it said before many times, and I kind of alluded to it. Sometimes your story ends up becoming someone else's survival manual. And what a cool thought.
Exactly.
Hmm. Well, I wanted to ask, I had something I wanted to say at the end here, but I wanted to ask, was there anything you wanted to add that we didn't get to before I give this a final word?
Um, I will just say, because you mentioned what's what's been helpful to me in my deconstruction. And there's a resource which I wasn't available until recently, probably within the last 5 years, which is like these Facebook groups that I've joined for fellow deconstructing Christians or people that are just leaving their religion. And like the first part of my deconstruction process was so lonely. I was all alone having these thoughts and these questions and doing this research, and now I don't feel so alone anymore because I feel like I have this online community of total strangers, such as yourself, but who've been there. And we share, like, what about this? Did you go through this? What about this? Or even just funny, irreverent memes, or or just jokes of like someone that can get that. Why is that funny? So it's been really amazing to find these Facebook groups and join them and be able to feel this community, which I hope that with my book, I can even grow that community bigger. So just to emphasize, like, that we are definitely not alone. There's a lot of people going through this, and to be able to find them and communicate with them is really cool.
Yeah, well said. Such an important piece of this is re-establishing some kind of community if possible, even if it's just online. And hopefully, ideally, some of us can meet up in person here or there, but to just get something, because yeah, and a lot of cases I've heard, you really end up like if you're in the Bible Belt or whatever they would call it, you're just surrounded. There's a church on every corner, and everything is starting with prayer. Even sporting events, whatever. Like everything is about the Lord Jesus Christ, and you're just like you feel like you're in a foreign land, and to have
Mm.
some kind of support system is so critical. I do want to end by just saying, in churches, I don't know if you had this, but in my churches a lot, they would do the benediction, where the pastor would kind of raise his hands up and be like, just want to, the Lord bless you and keep you, or the peace of Christ sustain you, whatever.
Mhm.
I just kind of wanted to end not with a benediction, but with an affirmation. Um, I am not a counselor, and would never want to act like one, and I'd never want to anyone to see this channel or me as a replacement for that. But I do think that sometimes, just as lay people, as friends and people, on this journey, we can give each other affirmations. And I just wanted to kind of end with an affirmation to say, your life and your journey, despite all the hardships, sounds like you have made beautiful, wonderful choices. And I think I'm speaking for the people watching in saying that we're applauding you, we're cheering you on. Your heart is beautiful despite the ways people have written you off. Like, you have a beautiful heart, a beautiful mind, a beautiful spirit. The fact that you're willing to put yourself out there and be vulnerable in interviews and with your book is such a hard thing to do, because it is easy to just go quietly into the night. And to be willing to get the ostracization furthered by putting your story out there, that's the bravery it takes to do that in this context of what we've been talking about is so critical. But also just too in the context of all this theology, we talked about the worm theology. Just want to say, like, we all need to hear, you are worthy of good things. You're worthy of, despite all the abuses, everything from Yahweh to their marriages, you're worthy of the most beautiful parts of life, and for people truly unconditionally loving you. And I hope that those messages that you've been sending to your heart just keep on getting through all the layers. I feel like, that old game breakout where the ping pong, you break through all the layers and the ball would eventually get to the top and just start to go crazy, but just break through all these layers without even touching it. I hope, you and those of us thinking through this can get to those layers where just the beauty and the graciousness of being alive and human, and the beauty of life without mythology, that we're just fine the way we are. I hope that keeps just blessing you and giving you so much healing, because we all need it so badly. And the cool thing too, I love how we talked about in your bio, you're an artist, you're a writer. There's something about this journey, but when you escape it, for many of us, it just feels like our desire to create and to share stories and to write songs and write poetry and to do this and that, it just goes on steroids, because it's like, I have got so much beauty in my heart, and I always thought it was so dark and sinful. And like, you have so much beauty in your heart, and you're just like overflowing to say, I want to just bless, if I can use the Christian word, I just want to bless people so much with this beauty, and to create a poem, as it were, with my life that has nothing to do with Yahweh, but I'm arguably, and you're arguably, more beautiful than ever in your thought process, in your heart, more beautiful than ever because of having escaped this. And at the end of the day, boiling it down even further here as I wrap up, you're doing just fine. You're okay. You're more than okay. You're fully acceptable the way you are. And I hope people will hear that messaging come loud and clear through this interview, through this channel, through your story, through your book. And certainly I hope you hear it too from me and from our community. And we're so grateful for people like you doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful that you are putting this out there, like interviewing people and giving a forum for these ideas you're definitely helping, the community.
Thank you so much. It's definitely a privilege. I feel very, very honored to be able to be part of this and to hear people's stories, if I can speak right, and to be able to be the one asking the questions. It's definitely a privilege and an honor. So on that note, I'll just say thank you for sharing your story today. And let me wrap up here by saying we've been speaking with Sarah Caton. Sarah, thank you so much. And I'll have the links again beneath this video for the pre-edit for your book, and eventually for the final link for the book once it's published on May 10th. But Sarah, thank you so much. Great to hear your story. Great to get to know you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.